Imagine this: 85 hardened criminals in tailored suits and concealed weapons, standing shoulder to shoulder around a secluded estate. Inside, a bride in white prepares to marry the man who walked away from a life of crime for her. But outside the gates, her obsessive ex, the son of a rival crime boss, has assembled his own army, determined to stop the wedding at any cost. What happens next will shock you, because when these mobsters revealed their true intentions, no one saw it coming. The way these criminals chose to protect true love that day didn't just save a wedding, it changed the balance of power in the city forever. Today, I'm going to tell you the extraordinary story of how Skylar Blackwood and Ethan Reeves found love against impossible odds, why 85 members of the notorious Blackwood crime family stood guard at their secret wedding, and the unexpected twist that left even the most hardened gangsters speechless. This isn't just a story about criminals, it's about loyalty, redemption, and what happens when love forces even the most dangerous people to question everything they thought they believed. The streets of Westlake City had been divided for generations. The east side belonged to the Harlow family, who ran everything from protection rackets to high-end gambling operations. The west side was Blackwood territory, where Raymond Ray Blackwood had transformed his father's small-time loan sharking business into a sophisticated criminal enterprise. For 50 years, an uneasy peace had prevailed, not through friendship, but through mutual assured destruction. Each family had enough dirt on the other to guarantee mutually fatal prosecutions if war ever broke out. This fragile equilibrium depended on clearly established boundaries, territory, business interests, and most importantly, family. The unwritten rule that family members were off limits had preserved the peace through 3 generations of crime bosses, until Skylar Blackwood and Ethan Reeves shattered every boundary that had kept the city from erupting into violence. Looking back, it was inevitable, Detective Harper Wells would later tell the grand jury. The Blackwoods were evolving, legitimizing. The Harlows were getting more violent, more desperate. Something was going to break the balance. No one expected it would be a love story. Few outsiders understood the true power dynamics at play. To the public, Ray Blackwood was merely a successful businessman, with whispered connections to organized crime. In reality, his organization controlled the city's port, 3 city council members, and had informants in every level of local law enforcement. What made the Blackwoods different from their rivals was their strategic vision. They were transitioning toward legitimacy, building a legacy that could eventually operate entirely within the law. The Harlows, led by the aging Chester Harlow and his volatile son Jax, represented the old school of organized crime, brutal, direct, and increasingly erratic. As legitimate businesses took over their territory and law enforcement pressure increased, they responded with escalating violence rather than adaptation. While Ray Blackwood sent his daughter to business school, Chester Harlow taught his son how to make problems disappear in the abandoned quarry outside the city. 2 families, moving in opposite directions, explained former prosecutor Keith Sullivan, who would later play an unexpected role in the wedding day drama. The Blackwoods were looking toward the future. The Harlows were desperately clinging to the past. The first indication that something had changed came when Skylar Blackwood abruptly ended her 3-year relationship with Jax Harlow. The coupling had always been more strategic alliance than love match, a way for both families to maintain peace, while Skylar quietly gathered intelligence on Harlow operations. Their breakup threatened to unravel years of careful diplomacy. Rumors spread quickly through the criminal underworld. Some said Skylar had discovered Jax's affair with a cocktail waitress at his father's club. Others claimed she'd finally seen his true nature after he put one of his own men in the hospital over a minor disagreement. Few suspected the real reason, that Skylar Blackwood had fallen for Ethan Reeves, Jax's most trusted enforcer and the last person on earth she should have given her heart to. I knew it was insane. Skylar would later confide to her grandmother Elaine, the family matriarch and only person she truly trusted. But after years of calculating every move, every word, every relationship for the benefit of the family, I finally chose something just for me. For 2 months, they managed to keep their relationship secret. Clandestine meetings in neighboring towns, burner phones, elaborate covers for unexplained absences. But in their world, secrets were a luxury no one could afford for long. The beginning of the end came on a rainy Tuesday, when Darius D. Money Washington, Ray Blackwood's loyal lieutenant, spotted Skylar and Ethan leaving a hotel in a neighboring county. D. Money, who had watched over Skylar since she was a child, faced an impossible choice: betray his boss's daughter or withhold critical information from the man he'd sworn to protect. His decision, made in a split second of conflicted loyalty, would set in motion a chain of events that would culminate in bloodshed, betrayal, and an unprecedented display of criminal solidarity that would shock the entire city. As spring turned to summer, tensions escalated. Jax Harlow, humiliated by the breakup and suspicious of betrayal in his ranks, became increasingly erratic. Territories that had been respected for decades were suddenly contested. Minor disputes escalated into violent confrontations. And through it all, Skylar and Ethan continued their dangerous affair, each aware that discovery would mean death but unable to walk away from the only real thing in their carefully constructed false lives. Skylar Blackwood was born during a thunderstorm that knocked out power across the west side of Westlake City. The nurses at St. Mary's Hospital later swore that the moment Raymond Blackwood first held his daughter, lightning struck so close to the building that the backup generators failed. In the sudden darkness, Ray made 2 promises to his newborn daughter: that she would never know violence, and that she would inherit a legacy she could be proud of. For 28 years, Ray struggled to keep those promises. He sent Skylar to the finest schools in Switzerland, far from the family business. He created legitimate enterprises, restaurants, real estate companies, investment firms, that could one day belong to her without the shadows of their origins. And most importantly, he maintained a careful separation between his daughter and the brutal realities that funded her privileged existence. "My father built walls to protect me," Skylar once explained to Ethan. "So high and so thick that I spent most of my life trying to see what was on the other side." By the time she returned from Europe with dual degrees in finance and business administration, Skylar had already begun dismantling those walls. Through careful research and strategic eavesdropping, she had pieced together the true nature of the Blackwood Empire. Rather than rejecting her inheritance, she embraced it. Not the violence or extortion, but the opportunity to complete her father's vision of legitimacy. She was brilliant, Madison Chen, Skylar's closest friend and later her wedding planner, recalled. She could look at the most complicated money laundering operation and see not just how to hide it better, but how to transform it into something that could stand up to any scrutiny. At 24, Skylar convinced her reluctant father to make her the CFO of Blackwood Enterprises. Within 2 years, she had restructured their finances so effectively that nearly 60% of their income came from legitimate sources. Ray Blackwood's dream of a clean legacy suddenly seemed possible, accelerated by his daughter's financial genius. It was Ray who suggested the strategic alliance with the Harlow family through Skylar's relationship with Jax. "Keep your friends close and your enemies closer," he advised her. "We need time to complete our transition. 3 years, maybe 4. Can you give me that?" For the sake of her family, Skylar agreed. Jax Harlow was handsome, powerful, and initially charming. The son of Chester Harlow had learned to hide his cruelty behind a veneer of sophistication. By day, he cultivated the image of a nightclub owner and socialite. By night, he oversaw the most violent aspects of his family's operations with disturbing enthusiasm. "The problem with masks," Skylar would later reflect, "is that they always slip eventually, and when Jax's did, what I saw terrified me." As Skylar grew increasingly disillusioned with her role as Jax's girlfriend, Ethan Reeves was facing his own crisis of conscience across town. Ethan's entry into the criminal world had been born of necessity rather than ambition. At 14, with his mother working 3 jobs and his younger sister in need of expensive asthma medication, he began running errands for local Harlow soldiers. By 16, his intelligence and unflappable demeanor had caught the attention of Chester Harlow himself. "The kid never panics," Chester told his son. "That's rarer than you think in our business." Unlike many who entered the life, Ethan maintained a strict moral code. He wouldn't deal with human trafficking, he refused to target civilians, and he never used more force than necessary to accomplish a goal. These principles earned him respect but also suspicion. In a world of sharks, Ethan's selective ethics made him unpredictable. By 27, Ethan had become Jax Harlow's most effective enforcer and most dangerous liability. He knew too much, observed too carefully, and most worryingly for the Harlows, seemed increasingly disconnected from the violence that had once been just business to him. "I started having these dreams," Ethan confessed to Skylar during one of their early meetings. "I'd see all their faces. Not just the ones I hurt, but the ones I stood by and watched get hurt. Every single night just staring at me." His insurance policy, secretly recording Harlow family meetings, and storing the evidence with a childhood friend, now working as a federal prosecutor, was meant to be a last resort, a way out if things went bad. He never intended to use it to bring down the organization, until he met Skylar and glimpsed a different kind of future. Their worlds collided at the annual Westlake Children's Hospital Benefit Gala, a PR exercise where both families donated generously to demonstrate their civic-mindedness while conducting business in the shadows. Skylar attended on Jax's arm, playing her part flawlessly despite having discovered bruises on her assistant's wrist after a meeting with her boyfriend the previous day. Ethan was there as security, standing silently against the wall, watching for threats to the Harlow family. Their eyes met across the ballroom during a champagne toast. For Ethan, it was like seeing a mirror reflection, someone playing a role, trapped in a life chosen for them rather than by them. For Skylar, it was recognition of a kindred spirit, someone else searching for redemption in a world built on sin. Neither could have predicted how that single moment of connection would unravel both their carefully constructed lives and ultimately force 85 hardened criminals to make an unprecedented choice that would change the balance of power in Westlake City forever. Westlake City existed in two separate realities. The version presented in tourism brochures showcased gleaming skyscrapers, a revitalized waterfront district, and exclusive gated communities nestled against the mountains. This Westlake boasted the third lowest unemployment rate in the state and was repeatedly voted one of America's most livable mid-sized cities by national publications. Then there was the Westlake that existed in the shadows, a city where neighborhood boundaries were determined not by property values but by which family controlled the territory, where certain businesses paid protection instead of just taxes, and where police response times mysteriously varied depending on which addresses called for help. "It's like living in two cities simultaneously," explained Detective Harper Wells, who had spent 15 years in Westlake's organized crime division without a single major conviction against either family. Most citizens lived their entire lives in the first Westlake, completely unaware of the second one operating right underneath their noses. The Blackwood family headquarters occupied the top 3 floors of the Blackwood Tower, a gleaming glass and steel structure on the west side waterfront. The building housed their legitimate businesses, real estate holdings, investment firms, and the corporate offices of their restaurant chain. Ray Blackwood's private office featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor, original artwork from contemporary masters, and a state-of-the-art security system that made it virtually impossible to enter without an invitation. It was in this office, 3 weeks after the charity gala, that Ray Blackwood received the news that would shatter the fragile peace between the families. "Sir, we have a situation," Darius Washington said as he entered without knocking, a privilege granted only in emergencies. The rain lashed against the windows as thunder rumbled in the distance, eerily similar to the night Skylar was born. "What kind of situation?" Ray asked, not looking up from the development proposals spread across his desk. "It's about Skylar," D-Money said, his usual confidence faltering. "And Ethan Reeves." Across town, the Harlow family operated from a very different base of power. The Red Crown nightclub served as their public-facing business, occupying a converted warehouse in what had once been the industrial district, but was now marketed as the Arts and Entertainment Zone. The club's VIP section concealed a heavily guarded private lounge, where Chester Harlow conducted business while maintaining the fiction that he was merely a successful nightclub owner. Beneath the club's throbbing music and flashing lights, Jax Harlow received similar news in his father's office. The messenger was a bartender who moonlighted as one of their surveillance specialists. Unlike D-Money's solemn delivery, this came with smartphone photos, grainy but unmistakable images of Skylar and Ethan outside a boutique hotel in Hammond County. "Are you absolutely certain?" Jax asked, his voice dangerously quiet as he stared at the images. "Yes, sir. I followed them myself. They spent 3 hours inside before leaving separately." In the center of the city, equidistant from both family territories, stood the historic Westlake Plaza Hotel. Built in the 1932. The plaza had weathered the city's various transformations with dignified elegance. Its neutral ground status made it one of the few venues where members of opposing organizations could meet without arousing suspicion. It was here, in a secluded corner of the hotel's renowned Oak Bar, that Madison Chen first proposed the idea that would eventually lead to 85 mobsters surrounding a wedding venue. "You need to leave," Madison told Skylar urgently, sliding a manila envelope across the polished wood table. Inside were train tickets to Chicago, a key to an apartment, and $50,000 in cash. "Both of you, tonight." Skylar pushed the envelope back without opening it. "I'm not running away, Maddie. Your father knows," Madison whispered, leaning closer. "D-Money told him yesterday, and someone in the Harlow organization has photos of you and Ethan. Jax is on a rampage. He put 2 of his own guys in the hospital, just for suggesting you might have left him voluntarily. The elegant bar, with its dark wood paneling and discreet lighting, suddenly felt suffocating. Skylar glanced around, wondering which of the well-dressed patrons might be reporting her movements back to her father or to Jax. "How bad is it?" she finally asked. Madison, who had grown up with Skylar, and now ran the city's most exclusive event planning business, while occasionally helping launder money through elaborate parties for both family, didn't sugarcoat her answer. "Your father hasn't given any orders yet. He's in shock, I think. But the Harlows. Jax is calling it a betrayal on both sides. He's demanding Ethan's head and your return." The weight of the situation pressed down on Skylar. Her relationship with Ethan had begun as a rebellion, a claim to something genuine in a life built on strategic calculations. But over the past months, it had become something else entirely. A vision of a different future. A path out of the life for both of them. "I need to talk to my father," Skylar said finally. "Make him understand." Madison shook her head. "It's too late for understanding. The only question now is whether this ends with one death or dozens." As Madison spoke, Ethan was having a similar conversation with Keith Sullivan, the former prosecutor who had left the district attorney's office under a cloud of scandal, and now served as pastor of a small church on the city's north side. Few knew that Sullivan had been Ethan's childhood neighbor, the one adult who had tried to steer him away from the Harlow organization, and now the reluctant keeper of the evidence Ethan had gathered against his employers. "They'll kill you," Sullivan said plainly, pouring himself a drink in the modest apartment behind the church. "Jax already has men looking for you. The only reason you're still breathing is they haven't found you yet." "I need more time," Ethan insisted. "If I release the evidence now, both organizations go down, including the Blackwoods, including Skylar." Sullivan studied his former protégé carefully. "You really love her, don't you? Enough to die for it?" Ethan didn't answer directly. There has to be a way out where no one else gets hurt. Outside, the summer storm that had been threatening all day finally broke, sending sheets of rain against the windows. In 3 separate locations across Westlake City, 3 conversations were setting the stage for a confrontation that would force everyone, from the most powerful crime bosses to the lowest soldiers, to choose sides in an unprecedented conflict where the battleground would be a wedding, and the stakes would be nothing less than the future of the city's underworld. The Blackwood estate sat on 5 acres of manicured grounds overlooking the western shore of Lake Westlake. The colonial-style mansion, with its white columns and wraparound porches, projected an image of old money and respectability that Ray Blackwood had carefully cultivated. Inside, however, the traditional architecture concealed state-of-the-art security and a panic room that could withstand military-grade assault. It was past midnight when Skylar's car passed through the wrought iron gates and wound its way up the long driveway. The security detail, doubled since news of her relationship with Ethan had emerged, tracked her approach with visible tension. No one knew exactly how Ray Blackwood would respond to his daughter's betrayal, but everyone understood that tonight would determine the family's path forward. Elaine Blackwood, Skylar's 7-8-year-old grandmother, and the true power behind the Blackwood Empire, waited on the front porch despite the late hour and lingering rain, tiny and elegant in a silk robe, with silver hair pulled back in a neat chignon. She looked like someone's sweet grandmother, not the woman who had guided the family through 2 previous succession crises with ruthless efficiency. "He's in his study," Elaine said, embracing her granddaughter briefly. "He's had 3 scotches. No more, no less." "Is that good or bad?" Skylar asked, smoothing her rain-dampened hair. "It means he's thinking, not reacting," Elaine replied. "Go, I've said what I can." The walk to Ray Blackwood's study felt like the longest of Skylar's life. The household staff vanished as she approached, disappearing into side rooms or suddenly finding tasks in distant parts of the house. No one wanted to witness what was coming. Ray stood with his back to the door, gazing out at the storm over the lake, a crystal tumbler of scotch in his hand. He didn't turn when Skylar entered, nor when she closed the door behind her with a soft click. "Did you think I wouldn't find out?" he finally asked, his voice carefully controlled. "I knew you would eventually," Skylar answered, deciding that only complete honesty had any chance of reaching him. "I just needed time to figure out a solution that wouldn't hurt the family." Ray turned then, studying his daughter with eyes that had ordered men killed but had also watched her take her first steps. "A solution? To what problem? Exactly? The problem of you sleeping with the enemy? The problem of you throwing away everything we've built for a cheap thrill? It's not like that," Skylar said, keeping her voice steady. "Ethan wants out of the life. He has evidence against the Harlows that could destroy them without touching us. We could take their territory, their operations, everything, legally, cleanly. For a moment, Ray seemed to consider this. The strategist in him recognized the opportunity, but then his expression hardened. And what happens when he decides he has evidence against us too? When his principles suddenly extend to the Blackwood family? He wouldn't. He's a Harlow enforcer, Skylar. Whatever he's told you, whatever he's promised, his loyalty belongs to them. People don't change. You did, Skylar countered. Grandma told me what the organization was like when you took over from grandfather. The trafficking, the drugs, all of it. You changed the family. You built something better. Ray set down his glass with deliberate care. I did that for you. Everything I've done, every line I've drawn, every risk I've taken to legitimize our interests, was so you wouldn't have to make the choices I made. And how do you repay me? By bringing us to the brink of war. Across town, a very different confrontation was unfolding at the Red Crown. Jax Harlow, fueled by cocaine and rage, had summoned his inner circle to the office behind the VIP lounge. The music from the club provided a pulsing backdrop to his increasingly erratic planning. I want him found, Jax commanded, pacing the room like a caged animal. I want him brought to me alive. I'll make an example of him that no one in this city will ever forget. Chester Harlow, watching his son with growing concern, attempted to inject reason into the situation. We need to be strategic about this. The Blackwoods are just as betrayed as we are, Jax interrupted. Ray's not going to start a war over his daughter's whore. The crude description sent a ripple of discomfort through the room. Several of the men present had worked with Ethan for years. While they understood the need for consequences, the personal nature of Jax's vendetta crossed lines that made even hardened criminals uncomfortable. And what about Skylar? Chester pressed, trying to make his son see the larger implications. If we move against Ethan, the Blackwoods will. Skylar is mine, Jax declared, his eyes wild with possessive fury. She made a commitment. She doesn't just get to walk away. Once Ethan is dealt with, she'll come back where she belongs. The older men exchanged glances. Jax's obsession with Skylar had always seemed more about control than affection, but tonight revealed a dangerous fixation that threatened to upend the careful balance between the families. As the storm intensified outside, two parallel conversations reached their critical points. In Ray Blackwood's study, Skylar made a decision that would irrevocably alter her relationship with her father. I'm going to marry him, she said quietly. With or without your blessing. The words hung in the air between them, a declaration of independence that Ray had never anticipated from his dutiful daughter. At that exact moment, in the back office of the Red Crown, Jax Harlow issued the order that would set in motion the events leading to the confrontation at the wedding. Put the word out, he commanded. 1 million to whoever brings me Ethan Reeves. 2 million if he's still breathing when they do. The bounty, unprecedented in its size, transformed a personal vendetta into a citywide manhunt. By morning, every criminal, mercenary, and opportunist in Westlake would be looking for Ethan, drawn by the enormous reward and fear of Jax Harlow's wrath. In the span of a single stormy night, the stage was set for a conflict that would force 85 mobsters to make an impossible choice and lead to the most unexpected display of criminal solidarity the city had ever witnessed. The bounty on Ethan Reeves transformed Westlake City overnight. By dawn, his face circulated on burner phones across the criminal underworld. Street corners normally controlled by competing organizations suddenly saw unprecedented cooperation as Harlow and independent operators alike searched for the man who had dared to cross Jax Harlow. It was like watching ants swarm when you kick their hill, Detective Harper Wells later testified. Suddenly everyone from high-level enforcers to street-level dealers was working together. The only thing that unites criminals faster than profit is fear. Jax offered them both. For 72 hours, Ethan remained completely invisible. No credit card transactions, no cell phone activity, no sightings by the extensive network of informants maintained by both police and criminals. It was as if he had evaporated from Westlake entirely. In reality, he was hiding in plain sight. In a maintenance room at Blackwood Tower, the last place anyone would think to look for a Harlow enforcer. Madison Chen, using her event planning business as cover, had smuggled him into the building through the loading dock during a catering delivery for a corporate event on the 20th floor. It was Skylar's idea, Madison later explained. She said the safest place for him was literally under her father's nose. Ray Blackwood would never imagine she'd bring him into the heart of family territory. While Ethan remained hidden, Skylar moved between two worlds. To the public and most of her father's organization, she was simply focusing on business, working longer hours than usual at Blackwood Enterprises. But each night, she secretly descended to the maintenance level, bringing food and updates on the increasingly volatile situation unfolding across the city. On the 4th day of Ethan's disappearance, the first blood was spilled. A mid-level Harlow dealer thought he recognized Ethan entering an apartment building on the east side. Without verifying, he called in the sighting to Jax directly. By the time the Harlow crew realized they had the wrong man, just someone of similar height and build, they had already beaten him severely enough to require hospitalization. The victim, it turned out, was the nephew of a Blackwood lieutenant. That's when it stopped being just about Skylar and Ethan, D-Money later recalled. Now it was about respect, about boundaries. The Harlows had crossed a line, and everyone was watching to see how Ray would respond. Ray Blackwood's response was characteristically measured. Rather than immediate retaliation, he called a meeting with Chester Harlow at the neutral ground of the Westlake Plaza Hotel. The two aging crime bosses, who had maintained an uneasy peace for decades, met in a private dining room with only their most trusted lieutenants present. "Call off the hunt," Ray demanded without preamble. "Before this gets any further out of hand." Chester Harlow, looking older and more tired than anyone could remember, shook his head. "It's beyond my control now. Jax has made this personal." "Then control your son," Ray countered. "Before I'm forced to do something we'll both regret." The threat hung in the air between them, explicit enough to be clear, vague enough to allow Chester a path to de-escalation without losing face. For a moment, it seemed the older Harlow might choose peace. "Ethan betrayed us," Chester said finally, "and your daughter facilitated that betrayal. In the old days there wouldn't even be a conversation about this." "We don't live in the old days anymore," Ray reminded him. "Times have changed. Maybe you should too, before you lose everything trying to hold on to the past." The meeting ended without resolution, but its failure resonated throughout both organizations. Lines were being drawn, sides were being chosen. The careful neutrality that many had maintained between the families was becoming impossible to sustain. Meanwhile, the pressure on Skylar intensified from an unexpected direction. Elaine Blackwood, who had initially supported her granddaughter's rebellion, now counseled pragmatism over passion. "Your father is putting everything on the line for you," she told Skylar during a rare moment when they were certain they weren't being overheard. "His authority, his reputation, the peace he's spent decades building. Are you sure this man is worth it?" "This isn't just about Ethan," Skylar insisted. "This is about taking control of my own life, making my own choices for once." Elaine's eyes, sharp despite her years, studied her granddaughter carefully. "And if those choices lead to people dying? Our people? Could you live with that?" The question hit Skylar like a physical blow. In the intensity of her relationship with Ethan and the drama of their discovery, she had managed to avoid fully confronting the potential consequences of their actions. Now, faced with her grandmother's blunt assessment, the weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders. That night, she descended to the maintenance room with her usual bag of supplies, her expression grave. Ethan, who had spent his days reviewing blueprints of Harlow properties and creating detailed files on their operations, immediately sensed something had changed. "They hurt someone looking for you," Skylar said without preamble. "An innocent person, a family member." Ethan set down the papers he'd been reviewing. "Who? It doesn't matter who. What matters is this is escalating exactly the way we feared. Then we need to execute the plan now," Ethan said, gesturing to the laptop where he'd been compiling evidence. "We have enough to put Jax away for decades. Probably Chester too, if we move quickly." "And what happens to my father?" Skylar interrupted. "To my family? To everything they've built?" The unspoken truth hung between them. Ethan's evidence against the Harlows could not be deployed without revealing interconnections with Blackwood operations. The legal firewall Skylar had carefully constructed over the years might protect some of their legitimate businesses, but the investigation would inevitably expose enough to destroy her father's organization as well. "There has to be another way," Skylar insisted, pacing the small room. "Something that eliminates the threat without destroying everything else." Ethan watched her with growing concern. "What are you suggesting?" Skylar stopped pacing, her decision visibly crystallizing. "We need to disappear. Completely. No evidence released, no one arrested. Just gone. New identities, new life. Somewhere the Harlows can never find us. Your father would never stop looking for you," Ethan pointed out gently. "He would if he believed I was happy," Skylar countered. "If he knew I was safe." As they debated their limited options, neither was aware that events had already spiraled beyond their control. Across town, Jax Harlow's obsession had evolved into something even more dangerous than vengeance. In the back room of the Red Crown, He unveiled a plan to his increasingly concerned inner circle. A plan so audacious and violent that it would force both families past the point of no return. "I'm done waiting," Jax announced, spreading a map of Blackwood Tower across the table. If the mountain won't come to Mohammed. The escalating tension had reached its breaking point, setting the stage for a desperate gambit that would lead to 85 mobsters making an unprecedented choice and changing the balance of power in Westlake forever. The attack on Blackwood Tower came at precisely 2:17 a.m., when security was at its minimum, and most of the building's legitimate businesses were long closed. Using stolen maintenance uniforms and forged ID cards, 8 Harlow enforcers entered through the loading dock, neutralized the night guards with surgical precision, and made their way to the executive floor, where they believed they might find information on Skylar's whereabouts, or better yet, Skylar herself. What they didn't know was that Darius Washington had quietly upgraded security protocols after the tension between the families began. Silent alarms triggered the moment the intruders bypassed the main security desk. By the time they reached the executive level, D-Money had already evacuated the overnight staff and activated the building's lockdown procedure, trapping the Harlow crew between secured fire doors. Ray Blackwood received the call at his estate. "They're inside," D-Money reported tersely. 8 of them, armed. "We have them contained for now." "Skylar?" Ray demanded, already reaching for the gun he kept in his bedside drawer. "In the panic room with Madison. They haven't found them. But boss, this isn't just a message. They came heavy. They came to kill." The direct assault on Blackwood territory shattered the remaining barriers to open conflict. Within hours, Ray had summoned every captain, lieutenant, and trusted soldier to an emergency meeting at the estate. Men and women who had built careers in both legitimate and illegitimate businesses arrived in waves, filling the grand ballroom that had hosted charity fundraisers and political gatherings, but never a war council. Skylar, extracted from the tower under heavy guard, watched from the back of the room as her father addressed the assembled force, over 100 individuals representing every aspect of Blackwood operations. "For 30 years, Ray began, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "We have maintained peace in this city through restraint and strategic thinking. That peace ended tonight when Jax Harlow sent armed men into our headquarters." A murmur ran through the crowd. Many had heard rumors of the incident, but direct confirmation from Ray himself transformed speculation into certainty. "Some of you have questioned my handling of the situation with my daughter," he continued, his eyes briefly finding Skylar at the back of the room. "You've wondered why I didn't simply hand over Ethan Reeves to the Harlows, why I risked conflict to protect one man." Ray paused, surveying the room. "I protected him because my daughter chose him, and in this family, we stand by our own. Not out of blind loyalty, but because trust is the foundation of everything we've built. The moment we sacrifice one of our own for convenience is the moment we become no better than the Harlows." The declaration sent a ripple of surprised reactions through the assembly. For years, Ray had pushed the organization toward legitimacy, distancing them from the old-school mafia mentality of family above all. Now he was invoking those very principles, but reframing them as a strategic advantage rather than an outdated liability. "Make no mistake," Ray continued, his voice hardening. "This is not just about Skylar and Ethan. This is about Jax Harlow testing our resolve, testing our unity. If we falter now, everything we've built crumbles." From her position at the back, Skylar watched the transformation with a mix of awe and concern. This was a side of her father she had glimpsed only rarely. The true crime boss beneath the legitimate businessman, the leader who commanded not just respect but fierce loyalty from hardened criminals. "I'm not asking you to die for my daughter's relationship," Ray clarified, addressing the unspoken concern in the room. "I'm asking you to stand against an organization that believes it can invade our territory, threaten our people, and face no consequences. I'm asking you to protect our future." One by one, the assembled captains and lieutenants voiced their support, some out of genuine loyalty to Ray, others from calculated self-interest, recognizing that a Blackwood victory would mean expanded territory and opportunities. A few simply hated the Harlows enough to welcome any excuse for open conflict. Madison Chen made her way through the crowd to Skylar's side as the meeting continued. "Where's Ethan?" Skylar whispered. "Still at the tower," Madison replied quietly. D-Money moved him to a different hiding spot after the attack. "He's secure for now." "I need to see him," Skylar insisted. "Tonight." Madison glanced nervously at the mobilizing Blackwood forces. "That's not going to be easy." Your father has practically put you under house arrest for your own protection. Then we'll need to be creative, Skylar said, a plan already forming. And I'll need your help. Across town, a parallel meeting was taking place at the Harlow compound. Unlike the organized war council at the Blackwood estate, this gathering had the desperate energy of a regime in crisis. The failed raid on Blackwood Tower had resulted in the capture of 8 Harlow enforcers, men who knew names, operations, and weaknesses that could destroy the organization if they talked. Chester Harlow, pale and visibly shaken, confronted his son in front of their diminished inner circle. "What the hell were you thinking? You launched an attack on Blackwood Tower without authorization, without even a goddamn plan for extraction." Jax, riding a wave of cocaine and adrenaline, seemed unconcerned by the disaster he had precipitated. "We needed to send a message. Show strength." "Strength?" Chester exploded. 8 of our best men captured isn't strength. It's a catastrophe. Ray will make them talk. You know he will. The older Harlow turned to his remaining captains. "We need to move operations. Shut down anything the captured men knew about. Relocate our cash reserves. And for God's sake, someone find Ethan Reeves before this gets any worse." But as Chester tried desperately to mitigate the damage, it was becoming clear to everyone in the room that control had already shifted. The younger soldiers, many of whom had been recruited directly by Jax, looked to him for guidance rather than his father. The old guard might recognize the disaster unfolding, but they were increasingly outnumbered by Jack's loyalists who embraced his more aggressive approach. As the 2 crime families mobilized for what would become the most significant power struggle in Westlake's history, Skylar Blackwood made a decision that would ultimately require 85 mobsters to make an unprecedented choice. In the library of her family estate, surrounded by first edition books collected by 3 generations of Blackwoods, she looked at Madison Chen with newfound resolve. "I need you to plan a wedding," she said quietly. Immediately, Madison stared at her in disbelief. "A wedding? Now? In the middle of all this?" "Not just any wedding," Skylar clarified. "A statement. Something so public, so undeniable, that it forces everyone to choose sides once and for all." Understanding dawned on Madison's face. "You're going to use your own wedding as the battlefield." Skylar nodded. "Find me a venue. Something defensible but symbolic. And Madison, make sure there's room for a lot of security. We're going to need it." As dawn broke over Westlake City, the battle lines were drawn, not around territories or businesses, but around a bride, a groom, and a wedding that would become the most heavily guarded ceremony in criminal history. Madison Chen's reputation as Westlake's premier event planner was built on her ability to create miracles on impossible deadlines. Organizing a high-security wedding in the middle of an emerging mob war, however, tested even her considerable skills. The venue was the first challenge, Madison later recalled. It needed to be defensible but not obviously fortified, private but accessible, and most importantly, it needed symbolic significance that would resonate with both families. After rejecting a dozen possibilities, Madison found the perfect location: Riverview Chapel, a decommissioned church perched on the bluffs overlooking the river that divided East and West Westlake. The stone building had been converted into an event space that maintained its historic architecture, including thick walls, limited entry points, and a commanding view of approaching vehicles from all directions. Most significantly, it sat precisely on the invisible boundary between Blackwood and Harlow territories, belonging fully to neither side. "It's perfect," Skylar declared when Madison showed her photos. "Neutral ground with the moral high ground built in." With the venue secured, Madison assembled a team of trusted vendors who had worked Blackwood events before. Professionals who understood discretion and wouldn't ask questions about the unusual security requirements. Invitations, however, presented a more complex challenge. Who exactly invites mobsters to a wedding in the middle of a gang war? Madison asked during a tense planning session in the panic room at Blackwood Tower, where Ethan had been relocated after the failed Harlow raid. "We don't invite them," Skylar explained. "We force them to make a choice. My father's people will be there as security regardless. But we need to make it clear to everyone in both organizations that attendance is a declaration of allegiance." Ethan, who had spent the past week compiling dossiers on key players in both organizations, identified the power brokers who needed to be approached personally. "There are at least 20 captains straddling the line between the families. If we can get them to commit to protecting the wedding, others will follow." The strategy required delicate execution. Direct outreach came from unlikely sources: Elaine Blackwood reaching out to old connections, Detective Harper Wells dropping hints to informants, Even Pastor Keith Sullivan, using his position to arrange counseling sessions with individuals connected to both families. It became about more than just Skylar and Ethan, Detective Wells later testified. The wedding turned into a referendum on the future of Westlake's underworld, traditional values versus unbridled violence, strategic business versus short-term gains. People who'd spent decades in the shadows suddenly found themselves having to publicly choose sides. As word spread throughout the criminal community, unexpected allies emerged from both organizations. Veteran enforcers who had worked with Ethan respected his principled approach and professionalism. Financial operators who had benefited from Skylar's legitimization efforts worried about returning to the chaotic business practices of the past. Even some Harlow soldiers, concerned about Jax's increasingly erratic behavior, quietly indicated their support. D-Money, tasked with coordinating security for the event, quickly realized they were dealing with something unprecedented. It started as a protective detail, he explained. Maybe 20, 30 of our most trusted people. But then, captains started volunteering additional men. Retired enforcers offered to come back for one day. Even some of the legitimate business managers wanted to help. The growing support didn't go unnoticed. 5 days before the wedding, Ray Blackwood called his daughter to his study, where D-Money was reviewing security protocols. 85, Ray said without preamble. That's how many of our people have committed to standing guard at your wedding. 85 soldiers, captains, and associates, willing to risk war with the Harlows to protect you and Ethan. Skylar absorbed this information with a complex mix of emotions, gratitude, concern, and the weight of responsibility for what these people were risking. This is bigger than us now, isn't it? She asked quietly. Ray nodded. It always was. You and Ethan just happened to be the catalyst for something that's been brewing for years. As the Blackwood organization mobilized around the wedding, the Harlows experienced a parallel but opposite phenomenon: fragmentation. The failed tower raid had exposed Jax's recklessness, leading several veteran captains to quietly distance themselves from daily operations. Some cited health concerns or family matters, others simply became unreachable at critical moments. Chester Harlow, watching his organization crumble from within, made a final attempt to wrest control from his son during a private conversation in their family home. This wedding is a trap, he warned Jax. Ray is consolidating power, drawing lines. Anyone who shows up is declaring for the Blackwoods. Anyone who makes a move against it becomes the villain. Jax, pacing like a caged animal, dismissed his father's concerns. Let them have their ceremony. It puts all our enemies in one place. One well-placed explosive device. Have you lost your mind? Chester interrupted, genuinely alarmed. Mass murder at a wedding? That doesn't just start a war. It brings down heat that none of us can handle. The feds would swarm this city, but Jax was beyond strategic consideration, consumed by his perceived humiliation. Skylar belongs to me, he insisted. She doesn't get to embarrass me like this. She doesn't get to choose someone else. Chester Harlow, recognizing the dangerous obsession that had overtaken his son, made a decision that would alter the course of events. That evening, he placed a call to an old acquaintance he hadn't spoken to in nearly a decade, Elaine Blackwood. Their conversation lasted less than 3 minutes, but its impact would reverberate throughout both organizations. No one knows exactly what was said, but immediately afterward, Chester began quietly moving assets to offshore accounts and preparing contingency plans for a swift departure from Westlake. 2 days before the wedding, as final preparations accelerated, Madison Chen discovered something alarming during her last venue walkthrough. A recently hired kitchen worker didn't match the background check information on file. Within hours, D-Money's team had identified him as a Harlow associate attempting to infiltrate the venue. Rather than eliminating the threat, D-Money made a strategic decision. Let him think he succeeded, he instructed his team. Feed him just enough information to make Jax overconfident. We need him to make his move where we can control the situation. The captured infiltrator became an unwitting double agent, reporting back security details that had been carefully curated to create the impression of vulnerabilities that didn't exist. Each piece of intelligence was designed to shape Jax's inevitable attack into a form the Blackwood security team could anticipate and counter. As the wedding day approached, an unusual calm settled over the city. Regular criminal operations on both sides slowed to a near standstill as all resources focused on the upcoming confrontation. In neighborhoods that had seen turf conflicts for generations, an unspoken truce temporarily prevailed. It was like the whole city was holding its breath, Pastor Sullivan recalled, waiting to see which vision of the future would prevail. On the eve of the wedding, 85 members of the Blackwood organization gathered at the estate for final briefings. They represented every aspect of the family's operations, from legitimate business people to hardened enforcers, from financial specialists to street-level operators. Despite their diverse backgrounds and roles, they were united by a common purpose that transcended simple loyalty to Ray Blackwood. "Tomorrow isn't just about protecting a wedding," Ray told the assembled force. "It's about declaring what kind of organization we are, what kind of city we want Westlake to be." As Ray spoke, the Blackwood soldiers traded knowing glances. Many had already guessed what the others only suspected: that the wedding wasn't just a defensive operation, but an elaborately staged trap designed to end the Harlow threat once and for all. What none of them realized was that the true plan was far more shocking than anyone could have anticipated, and would require these 85 hardened criminals to make a choice that would leave everyone speechless. Dawn broke over Riverview Chapel with golden light that belied the tension gripping the converted church. Security teams had been in position since 3 a.m., meticulously checking every corner of the building and grounds. Snipers occupied the bell tower and adjacent rooftops, while plainclothes enforcers patrolled the perimeter in rotating patterns designed to identify surveillance or approaching threats. Inside, Madison Chen orchestrated final preparations with military precision. Floral arrangements were checked for concealed devices. Catering staff underwent secondary identity verification. Even the wedding cake was subjected to discreet scanning to ensure nothing had been planted overnight. "It was surreal," Madison later recalled. "I'd planned security-conscious events before, but never one where the threat of assassination was so concrete. Never one where the decorative candelabras were positioned specifically to provide cover in case of gunfire." Schuyler prepared in the former rectory adjacent to the main chapel. The bridal suite, once the pastor's study, had been reinforced with bulletproof glass and staffed with 3 female Blackwood associates who were as comfortable with weapons as they were with cosmetics. "Are you nervous?" Elaine Blackwood asked, as she helped her granddaughter into the vintage lace gown that had been her own mother's decades earlier. "About marrying Ethan?" "No," Schuyler replied, studying her reflection in the antique mirror. "About what might happen today." Terrified, Elaine squeezed her granddaughter's shoulders gently. "Your grandfather would have loved this, you know. The drama of it all. He always said weddings and funerals were the only events worth attending, the only times people show their true loyalties." Across the complex, in what had once been the church office, Ethan Reeves prepared with D-Money and Pastor Sullivan. Unlike the typical pre-wedding nervous groom, Ethan projected calm intensity as he reviewed security protocols one final time. "The moment Jax makes his move, I need a direct line to Schuyler," he instructed. "No matter what happens, we stay connected." Sullivan, adjusting his clerical collar, studied the man he'd known since childhood. "Are you certain about this? There's still time to disappear. Start fresh somewhere else." "Running wouldn't solve anything," Ethan replied. "This ends today, one way or another." By 10 o'clock, guests began arriving, primarily legitimate business associates and political connections of the Blackwood family, who remained unaware of the true tension underlying the celebration. They were escorted through security checkpoints discreet enough to maintain the appearance of a normal high-society wedding, but thorough enough to prevent any unwelcome surprises. At precisely 10:47 a.m., the first intelligence came through. Jax Harlow had been spotted 3 blocks away, accompanied by 17 vehicles containing what appeared to be his most loyal soldiers. "Right on schedule," D-Money muttered, relaying the information to Ray Blackwood, who had positioned himself in the chapel's former confessional, now converted into a communications hub. "How many?" Ray asked. "Preliminary count suggests 30 to 40 men," D-Money reported, "heavily armed, moving in a convoy pattern." Ray processed this information calmly. The numbers aligned with their intelligence. Jax had lost too many supporters to mount a larger operation, but his remaining loyalists were the most dangerous and committed members of the Harlow organization. "Execute Phase 1, Ray ordered. Throughout the venue, subtle shifts in positioning took place as the 85 Blackwood protectors prepared for confrontation. Those with legitimate covers maintained their roles, while specialized enforcers moved to predetermined defensive positions. To casual observers, nothing seemed amiss, but the chapel had effectively transformed into a fortress prepared for siege. At 11:15 a.m., with guests seated and the ceremony minutes from beginning, the Harlow convoy arrived at the outer perimeter. Rather than an immediate assault, Jax deployed his men in a loose encirclement of the property, a classic containment strategy designed to control all possible exits. "He's playing it smarter than we expected," D-Money observed, setting up a proper perimeter instead of rushing in. Ray's expression remained unreadable. Proceed as planned. Begin the ceremony. The string quartet struck up the traditional wedding march as Skylar, radiant despite the circumstances, prepared to walk down the aisle on her father's arm. The guests, unaware of the armed standoff developing outside, turned expectantly toward the chapel doors. At that moment, Jax Harlow made his move, but not the one anyone had anticipated. Rather than launching a direct assault, he approached the main entrance alone, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit. When the security detail moved to intercept him, he raised his hands to show he was unarmed. "I'm here as a guest," he announced with unsettling calm, "to celebrate the union of my ex-girlfriend and my former employee." The security team, thrown by this unexpected approach, looked to D-Money for guidance. After a moment's hesitation, he gave a subtle nod, pat him down, thoroughly, then escort him in. Inside the chapel, Ray received word of this development with genuine surprise, the first crack in his usually imperturbable demeanor. "He's coming in alone? Unarmed?" "Appears so," D-Money confirmed, though his men remain in position outside. Ray turned to Skylar, who had been waiting in the vestibule for her entrance. "We need to delay. This changes everything." But Skylar, with a determination that reminded everyone present of her grandmother, shook her head. "No. We proceed exactly as planned. If Jax wants to watch, let him. It only makes our statement stronger." As the wedding march continued, Jax Harlow was escorted to a seat in the back row, surrounded by Blackwood enforcers prepared to neutralize him at the slightest provocation. His expression as he settled into the pew was unnervingly serene, not the rage-filled jealousy everyone had expected, but something more calculated and potentially more dangerous. The ceremony began with Pastor Sullivan addressing the gathered assembly, his voice steady despite the extraordinary tension filling the sacred space. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today not just to witness the union of Skylar and Ethan, but to support their choice to forge a new path together." As vows were exchanged under the watchful eyes of 85 armed protectors, the true confrontation was unfolding through subtle gestures and positioning throughout the chapel. Jax Harlow, sitting rigidly in the back row, maintained unwavering eye contact with Skylar. His men outside, receiving no signal from their leader, remained in their containment formation, creating a standoff that grew more confusing by the minute. What no one realized, not Ray, not D-Money, not even Skylar and Ethan, was that Jax's unexpected appearance at the ceremony was merely the first move in a far more elaborate strategy than anyone had anticipated. A strategy that would force the 85 Blackwood protectors to make a choice that would leave everyone speechless and forever change the power dynamics of Westlake City. The wedding ceremony progressed with surreal normalcy, despite the extraordinary circumstances. Skylar and Ethan exchanged vows with genuine emotion, their connection visible to everyone present. Pastor Sullivan guided them through the traditional promises with a calm authority that belied the tension crackling through the chapel. Throughout it all, Jax Harlow remained motionless in the back row, his expression unreadable as he watched his ex-girlfriend marry his former enforcer. "By the power vested in me," Sullivan intoned, reaching the conclusion of the ceremony, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." As Skylar and Ethan sealed their union with a kiss, scattered applause broke out among the legitimate guests, unaware of the armed standoff developing around them. The 85 Blackwood protectors maintained their positions, eyes constantly scanning for the first sign of Harlow aggression. The newly married couple turned to face their guests, and for a brief moment, it seemed the most dangerous part of the day might pass without incident. Then Jax Harlow rose from his seat. D-Money's team immediately tensed, hands moving toward concealed weapons. Ray Blackwood, watching from his position near the altar, gave a subtle hand signal. "Wait, but be ready. I'd like to offer a toast," Jax announced, his voice carrying clearly through the chapel. The request was so unexpected, so contrary to the violent confrontation everyone had anticipated, that it momentarily froze the security response. Before anyone could object, Jax continued, addressing the confused guests with the practiced charm that had made him so effective at cultivating political connections. "For those who don't know me, I'm an old friend of the bride's family," he said smoothly. "And while Skylar and I once had our own history, today is about her future." He raised an imaginary glass. To the happy couple, the bizarre civility of the moment created a ripple of confusion through the Blackwood ranks. This was not the jealous rage they had prepared for, not the violent assault their intelligence had predicted. Something else was happening, something no one had anticipated. Ray Blackwood, whose instincts had kept him alive and in power for decades, felt the shift immediately. "It's a diversion," he muttered to D-Money. "Check the perimeter. Now." As security teams scrambled to verify the status of the Harlow forces outside, Jax locked eyes with Skylar. "I've brought a wedding gift," he announced. "Something I think you'll find quite meaningful." From his jacket, he withdrew not a weapon, but a flash drive, holding it up so everyone could see. "This contains evidence of certain financial transactions between the Harlow organization and 3 city council members, a judge, and 2 police captains. Very comprehensive. Very damaging." A murmur ran through the chapel as the implications became clear to those who understood the underworld dynamics at play. Jax was offering leverage, the kind that could dismantle the protection networks that had shielded both families from serious prosecution for decades. "Why would you give us this?" Ethan asked, breaking the stunned silence. Jax's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Because it's not just Harlow operations on here. It's the entire system that both our families have relied on for generations. A system my father built alongside Ray Blackwood." Ray stepped forward, his expression grave. "What are you playing at, Jax?" "Mutual assured destruction," Jax replied simply, but with a twist. Outside, the situation suddenly escalated as Chester Harlow arrived unexpectedly, accompanied by federal agents in unmarked vehicles. The elder Harlow, looking defeated but resolute, was voluntarily leading law enforcement to the assembled Harlow forces surrounding the chapel. Inside, oblivious to this development, Jax continued his calculated performance. "You see, my father made a deal yesterday. Complete immunity in exchange for testimony against me and evidence against our political protection network. He gets to retire to some beach with a new identity, while I take the fall for everything." The revelation sent shockwaves through the chapel. Chester Harlow turning informant was unthinkable, a fundamental violation of the code that had governed Westlake's criminal hierarchy for generations. "My own father betrayed me," Jax continued, his composed veneer cracking slightly to reveal genuine pain beneath. "Just like Ethan did. Just like Skylar did." D-Money received urgent information through his earpiece and leaned in to whisper to Ray. The Blackwood patriarch's eyes widened momentarily before his expression hardened into grim determination. "The feds are outside," Ray announced to the room, cutting through Jax's monologue. "Moving on Harlow positions. Chester is with them." Panic flashed across Jax's face. The first authentic emotion he'd shown since entering the chapel. "Sooner than I expected," he muttered. "No matter. The plan remains the same." In that moment, the true nature of Jax's strategy became clear. He hadn't come to disrupt the wedding or reclaim Skylar. He'd come to force a choice upon everyone present, particularly the 85 Blackwood protectors stationed throughout the venue. "Here's my wedding gift to you," Jax said, tossing the flash drive to Ethan. "Everything needed to bring down both families. The corrupt officials, all of it. My father thinks his deal will save him, but this proves his direct involvement in every major operation for the past 20 years. He turned to address the Blackwood soldiers directly. "In about 60 seconds, this place will be surrounded by federal agents. You have a choice to make. Protect the happy couple from me," he paused meaningfully. "Or protect them from what's coming through those doors." The 85 mobsters looked to Ray Blackwood for guidance, but it was Skylar who stepped forward, still in her wedding dress, now assuming the mantle of leadership that had been her birthright. "D-Money," she commanded with unexpected authority. "Secure all exits. No one gets in until we decide how to handle this." As the Blackwood forces moved to barricade the chapel doors, Skylar turned back to Jax. "What exactly are you proposing?" "An alliance," Jax said simply. "Against a common enemy. The feds get my father's testimony, but if they can't find me, or you, it's incomplete. We use the chaos to disappear. All of us." The proposition hung in the air as sirens became audible in the distance. In that moment, with federal agents closing in and both criminal empires on the brink of collapse, the 85 mobsters guarding the wedding faced an unprecedented choice that would leave everyone speechless and forever alter the balance of power in Westlake City. The next 3 minutes unfolded with the choreographed precision of a ballet. If ballets involved armed mobsters, federal agents, and a bride in vintage lace making split-second decisions that would reshape an entire city's power structure. "Lock it down," Skylar ordered, her voice cutting through the growing panic in the chapel. "Secure all entrances. Buy us time." The Blackwood security teams moved with practiced efficiency, reinforcing barricades and establishing defensive positions at every possible entry point. Through the stained glass windows, flashing lights became visible as federal vehicles established a perimeter around the chapel grounds. Ray Blackwood watched his daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. In the crisis, she had instinctively assumed command, and more surprisingly, His people had responded to her authority without question. "You can't seriously be considering Jax's offer," Ray said quietly when she rejoined him near the altar. "I'm considering all options," Skylar replied, her eyes scanning the chapel as she assessed their position. "Including ones we haven't thought of yet." Ethan, still holding the flash drive Jax had tossed him, examined it thoughtfully. "This could be leveraged differently," he suggested. "Not for escape, but for negotiation." A voice crackled over a bullhorn outside, instructing everyone to remain calm and prepare for federal agents to enter the building. The 85 mobsters guarding the various positions looked to Skylar and Ray with increasing uncertainty. They had come prepared to protect a wedding from a jealous ex-boyfriend, not to engage in a standoff with federal authorities. Jax Harlow, seeing the hesitation, pressed his advantage. "You have maybe 2 minutes before they breach. Whatever you're going to do, decide now." Skylar turned to D-Money. "Where's my grandmother?" "East entrance," he replied immediately, overseeing that defensive position personally. "Get her," Skylar instructed. "And Madison." Immediately. As D-Money moved to comply, Ethan stepped closer to Skylar, speaking in a low voice meant only for her. "We always knew this day might come. The contingency plans are insufficient for this scenario," she finished for him. "We need something new, something unexpected." Elaine Blackwood arrived with the brisk efficiency that had characterized her decades as the family matriarch, Madison Chen following close behind. Despite her 78 years, Elaine showed no sign of fear or hesitation in the face of the crisis unfolding around them. "Quite the wedding reception you've arranged," she remarked dryly to her granddaughter. "We need to make a decision," Skylar said, gesturing for Madison, Ethan, Ray, Elaine, and surprisingly, Jax, to gather in a tight circle. "Not just for today, but for the future of everything we've built." Outside, federal agents had established breaching positions at all entrances. Through their communications network, the Blackwood security team reported that the Harlow forces had been mostly detained, with Chester Harlow visibly cooperating with authorities. "Whatever we decide," Ray observed grimly, "it needs to account for the fact that Chester has likely given them enough to dismantle both our organizations." Skylar nodded, her expression resolute. "Then we need to give them something bigger." For exactly 47 seconds, the inner circle conferred in urgent whispers, their plan evolving in real time as each contributed their perspective. When they broke apart, Skylar turned to address the assembled Blackwood protectors who were awaiting instructions. "I need you to make a choice," she announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the chapel, not just as soldiers following orders, but as individuals with a stake in the future. The federal bullhorn sounded again, issuing a 2-minute warning before forced entry. The tension in the chapel ratcheted higher as Skylar continued. "What I'm asking goes against everything you've been taught about loyalty and silence," she acknowledged. "It's unprecedented. It's risky. But it's also our only chance to preserve something from what's about to happen." As Skylar outlined her proposal, expressions of shock, disbelief, and then gradually, understanding, spread through the ranks of the 85 mobsters who had come to guard a wedding and now found themselves at the crossroads of Westlake's criminal history. "I'm not ordering you," Skylar concluded. "I'm asking. Each of you needs to decide for yourself." D-Money was the first to step forward. "I'm with you," he said simply. Then one by one the others declared their positions. Not all agreed. Several veterans of the old school shook their heads and stepped back, unwilling to break from tradition even in the face of certain destruction. But remarkably, 78 of the 85 Blackwood protectors aligned themselves with Skylar's radical proposal. "Tell them we're coming out," she instructed D-Money, "and that we have something they'll want more than arrests." What happened next would be recounted in Westlake City for decades, described in confidential FBI reports, and whispered about in criminal circles across the country. As federal agents prepared to breach the chapel doors, they were stunned when the barricades were removed from within and the doors opened voluntarily. Skylar Blackwood Reeves emerged first, still in her wedding gown, hands raised to show she carried no weapons. Behind her came Ethan, then Ray, then Elaine, and most surprisingly, Jax Harlow. Following them, in an orderly procession that left federal agents momentarily speechless, came 78 members of the Blackwood organization, captains, lieutenants, enforcers, and financial specialists who had collectively protected the wedding and were now making an even more extraordinary choice. "We have a proposal," Skylar announced to the senior FBI agent in charge, "one that will give you something much bigger than 2 crime families." In her hand, she held not just Jax's flash drive, but additional data devices containing comprehensive documentation of the entire corruption network that had protected both families for generations, judges, politicians, police officials, and business leaders who had enabled decades of criminal activity. Complete immunity for everyone who came out voluntarily, she stated clearly. In exchange for testimony and evidence that will dismantle the entire system, not just our piece of it. The federal agent, confronted with this unprecedented mass surrender and offer of cooperation, could only stare in disbelief. The 78 mobsters who had come to guard a wedding against a vengeful ex had instead become part of the largest organized crime defection in American history. That's why we needed the wedding to happen exactly as it did, Schuyler later explained to investigators. We needed everyone who was willing to make this choice in one place, committed to something bigger than just following orders. The resolution that unfolded from that extraordinary standoff would transform Westlake City forever, dismantling not just the Blackwood and Harlow organizations, but the corrupt infrastructure that had allowed organized crime to flourish for generations. The federal investigation that followed what journalists dubbed the wedding takedown unfolded over 18 months, generating headlines that rocked Westlake City and rippled through corridors of power across the state. The scope of corruption revealed through Schuyler's unprecedented deal stunned even veteran investigators who thought they understood the city's underworld dynamics. We expected to find some dirty cops and maybe a judge or two, Special Agent Marcus Torres, who led the task force, later told a congressional committee. What we uncovered was an entire shadow government, operating alongside the legitimate one. The Blackwood-Harlow testimony mapped out corruption networks that had been evolving for nearly 50 years. The numbers told the story. 27 public officials indicted, including 3 sitting judges, the police commissioner, 2 former mayors, and 7 current city council members. 14 high-ranking police officers arrested. 34 business leaders charged with various financial crimes related to money laundering and racketeering. The corruption had extended into every corner of city governance, creating a system where justice was available for purchase and regulations were selectively enforced based on payments and connections. True to the negotiated agreement, the 78 Blackwood associates who had surrendered at the chapel received immunity in exchange for their testimony. Ray Blackwood, as the organization's leader, faced more limited protections: immunity from prosecution for violent crimes, but accepting responsibility for financial violations that would require significant asset forfeiture, but no prison time. Chester Harlow's deal collapsed once the broader cooperation agreement was implemented. With dozens of witnesses now contradicting key aspects of his testimony and providing more comprehensive information, federal prosecutors determined he had violated his immunity agreement by withholding critical details. The elder Harlow was ultimately sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, his cooperation earning him nothing but the contempt of both organizations. Jax Harlow became the investigation's most surprising asset. Once his initial gambit at the wedding had evolved into Schuyler's more comprehensive surrender strategy, he embraced the role of informant with unexpected enthusiasm. His intimate knowledge of the more violent aspects of both family operations, combined with his connections to corrupt officials, provided crucial evidence for the most serious prosecutions. Jax's cooperation seemed driven by 2 things, Agent Torres observed in internal FBI documents later made public: a desire for revenge against his father, and a strange, almost competitive need to prove he could be more valuable to the investigation than either Schuyler or Ethan. For ordinary citizens of Westlake, the aftermath brought a disorienting mix of institutional upheaval and gradual improvement. Emergency special elections replaced indicted officials. A federal oversight committee supervised the restructuring of the police department. Property formerly controlled by criminal enterprises was auctioned or repurposed for community development. It was like watching a city wake up from a decades-long fever dream. Madison Chen reflected 1 year after the wedding. Suddenly, businesses that had paid protection for generations were free. Neighborhoods that had accepted certain blocks as just dangerous became safer almost overnight. The change was so profound that people struggled to remember why they had accepted the old reality for so long. For Schuyler and Ethan, the transition proved both more complicated and more rewarding than they had anticipated. Under the terms of their cooperation agreement, they retained ownership of the legitimately established Blackwood businesses, restaurants, real estate holdings, and investment firms that had been gradually separated from criminal enterprises over the previous decade. Schuyler's long-term strategy of legitimization, originally designed to protect family assets, ironically enabled them to emerge from the investigation with substantial legal wealth intact. We always knew the criminal side was unsustainable, Schuyler explained in a rare interview granted to the Westlake Business Journal 2 years after the events at the chapel. What we couldn't see was a path from one reality to the other without destruction. The wedding created that path, however unexpected its form. Ethan found his own unexpected role in the new Westlake, establishing a security consulting firm that specialized in helping businesses transition away from protection arrangements and develop legitimate security protocols. His understanding of both criminal operations and law enforcement perspectives made him uniquely qualified to bridge worlds that had previously existed in uneasy parallel. The greatest challenge, Ethan noted during a panel discussion at Westlake University's Criminal Justice Department, wasn't the legal transition but the cultural one. Generations of people had been raised with certain unwritten rules about how the city functioned. Rewriting those rules required more than just new laws. It required new stories about what Westlake could become. Not every outcome of the wedding's aftermath was positive. Several Blackwood associates who had refused to participate in the surrender faced lengthy prison sentences when prosecuted with evidence provided by their former colleagues. Certain neighborhoods experienced temporary spikes in unorganized crime as the structured control of the families dissolved before new policing practices could fill the void. And throughout the city, relationships fractured as people discovered family members, friends, and colleagues on opposite sides of the cooperation agreements. Perhaps most significantly, Ray and Elaine Blackwood found themselves navigating an unexpected retirement from power. After decades at the center of Westlake's shadow economy, they now occupied an ambiguous position, neither fully accepted in legitimate society nor connected to their former criminal networks. "My father struggles with it more than he admits," Schuyler confided to Madison during a quiet dinner 6 months after the wedding. His entire identity was built around control, protection, being the man who made problems disappear. Now he's just a businessman, Madison finished for her. A grandfather, eventually. Maybe that's enough. As the structural transformations of Westlake continued to unfold, the ripple effects of those 85 mobsters' choice at the wedding extended far beyond the city limits. Law enforcement agencies in neighboring jurisdictions launched similar investigations. Using the Westlake model as a template, state legislatures passed new anti-corruption measures specifically designed to prevent the systemic failures revealed through the testimony. And criminal organizations across the country studied the Blackwood-Harlow collapse as a cautionary tale about the vulnerabilities of traditional omertà in the face of coordinated defection. 3 years after the wedding that changed everything, a small plaque was installed on the exterior wall of Riverview Chapel. Its inscription, deliberately ambiguous to those unfamiliar with the full story, read simply, "On this site, 78 individuals chose a different future. Their choice transformed a city." On the 5th anniversary of what locals now simply called the wedding, Schuyler and Ethan Reeves hosted a private gathering at their home on the shores of Lake Westlake. The guest list included many familiar faces from that fateful day. D-Money, now running a legitimate private security firm; Madison Chen, whose event planning business had expanded to 3 additional cities; Pastor Sullivan, still leading his small congregation while counseling former criminal associates transitioning to legitimate lives; and Detective Harper Wells, who had leveraged her knowledge of the investigation into a promotion to captain in the reformed police department. Conspicuously absent were Ray and Elaine Blackwood, who had relocated to a quiet coastal community in Portugal once their asset forfeiture obligations were fulfilled. Their relationship with Schuyler remained complex, loving but strained by the radical choice she had made and the legacy they had lost. As evening fell and conversation flowed among those who had lived through Westlake's transformation, Ethan raised a glass for a toast. 5 years ago, he began, looking around at the gathered guests. We all came together for what we thought would be a wedding under siege. None of us, not me, not Schuyler, not even our enemies, could have predicted what actually happened that day. Schuyler, standing beside her husband with their 18-month-old daughter sleeping against her shoulder, continued the thought. We've been asked many times since then what made those 78 people choose to surrender rather than fight. Why hardened criminals, people who had spent decades operating outside the law, suddenly decided to cooperate on an unprecedented scale. The question hung in the air as those present reflected on their own roles in that extraordinary decision. It was D-Money who finally offered an answer. It wasn't just one thing, he said thoughtfully. For some, it was purely practical. They saw the writing on the wall with Chester turning informant and figured a coordinated surrender offered better terms than fighting separately. For others, it was loyalty to the Blackwood family, transferred from Ray to Schuyler in that critical moment. But I think for most of us, Madison added, It was something Skylar said right before we opened those doors. She told us we weren't just choosing between prison or freedom for ourselves. We were choosing what kind of city our children would inherit. Detective Wells nodded in agreement. Criminal organizations survive through isolation, convincing members that they're separate from society, that normal rules don't apply to them. What happened at that wedding broke through that isolation. Suddenly, decisions weren't about loyalty to a family but responsibility to a community. The conversation continued late into the night, weaving together personal reflections with broader observations about how cities evolve, how power transitions, and how seemingly immovable systems can change when enough people simultaneously choose a different path. As their guests finally departed, Skylar and Ethan stood on their deck overlooking the lake, the lights of the transformed Westlake twinkling along the opposite shore. "Do you ever regret it?" Ethan asked quietly, the question they rarely voiced to each other. "The family legacy, your father's empire." Skylar considered the question seriously, watching the city her family had once controlled through fear and leverage. "I regret that it took something so dramatic to create change. I regret the relationships strained or broken in the process." She shifted their sleeping daughter to her other shoulder. "But no, I don't regret the choice. We built something better than what we lost." The story of the 85 mobsters who guarded a wedding against a vengeful ex-boyfriend contains lessons that extend far beyond Westlake's transformation. It reminds us that systems that appear permanent are often more fragile than we imagine, maintained through shared beliefs and collective action rather than immutable laws of nature. When those beliefs shift, when enough individuals choose differently in a pivotal moment, even the most entrenched power structures can transform with surprising speed. It teaches us that significant change rarely comes from frontal assaults against established systems, but emerges from unexpected cracks, a personal relationship, a betrayal, a wedding that becomes something much more consequential than a simple ceremony. The most effective revolutions often begin not with grand manifestos but with individual choices that inspire others to reconsider their own options. Perhaps most importantly, the Westlake wedding demonstrates the cascading power of coordinated action. Those 78 individuals who walked out of Riverview Chapel into an uncertain future weren't simply surrendering to authorities. They were collectively imagining a different city and making the first move toward creating it. Their synchronized choice multiplied the impact of each individual decision, creating momentum that ultimately proved unstoppable. Today, Westlake City bears few visible scars from its divided past. New businesses occupy buildings once used for money laundering. Parks flourish in lots formerly controlled by criminal enterprises. Children play in neighborhoods previously defined by invisible boundaries of rival territories. If visitors ask locals about the small plaque on Riverview Chapel, they'll receive different versions of the story depending on who they ask. Some focus on the dramatic standoff, others on the corruption revelations that followed. A few might even mention the romantic aspects, the crime boss's daughter, and the enforcer who fell in love across enemy lines. But those who truly understand Westlake's transformation will point to the core truth embedded in that simple marker: that cities aren't just shaped by powerful forces beyond ordinary control, but by moments when people collectively imagine something different and find the courage to choose it. That even systems that have survived for generations can be reimagined when enough individuals simultaneously decide that another future is possible. And they might mention, with a hint of local pride, that this particular transformation began with 85 mobsters guarding a wedding against a vengeful ex-boyfriend, and the shocking choice that left everyone speechless.